Just a diploma mill temp playing real nurse. That's what Dr. Marcus Mercer had written in the staffing memo 3 months ago when Rachel Torres arrived at Seattle General in Savannah. He hadn't looked up from his desk when she introduced herself. Hadn't asked about her credentials beyond the cursory glance at the placement paperwork. Hadn't noticed the way her hands moved when she handled trauma shears, controlled angles, practiced precision, the kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from community college. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in a low, anxious frequency, casting harsh shadows across the white linoleum. Everything smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it, something copper and organic. Rachel moved through the controlled chaos with economical movements, invisible among the louder personalities, the residents shouting orders, the attending physicians gesturing with the confidence of men who'd never been questioned. She preferred it that way. 3 months of being underestimated was 3 months of operating without scrutiny. Seattle General's emergency department was running at capacity. A car accident victim in Bay 2. A heart attack in the observation area. The usual Tuesday night inventory of human fragility. Rachel was restocking the trauma cart in Bay 4 when the radio crackled. Dispatch called in an unidentified male, approximately 40 years old, found unconscious 2 blocks from the industrial district. Vitals unstable. ETA for minutes. She didn't look up. Just made sure the 14-gauge needles were in the tray, arranged the trauma shears at a precise angle, checked that the defibrillator pads were within arm's reach. Preparation was faith. When you'd worked in field medicine, you understood that readiness was the only prayer that mattered. The ambulance doors burst open at 11:08 p.m. 2 paramedics wheeled the stretcher in with controlled urgency. The man on it was in his mid-40s, muscular even in unconsciousness, his face weathered like someone who'd spent years in heat and dust. His shirt was torn, soaked dark with blood. His vitals were coming apart. BP 78/42 and dropping, the lead paramedic called out. Heart rate 142. Respiratory distress. Found him in an alley behind the warehouse district. No wallet. No identification. Possible blunt trauma to the chest and abdomen. Dr. Mercer appeared at the bay entrance like a silver-haired phantom, his presence somehow managing to make the space feel smaller. He gestured, and 3 residents moved to position the stretcher. Rachel stepped forward without being asked, cutting away the remnant of the man's shirt with her trauma shears. The blade moved with the kind of efficiency that comes from having done this under fire, from having triage priority etched into muscle memory like a second language. The man's chest was a landscape of old scars, some surgical, some not. Military tattoos. A faded anchor on his shoulder blade. Something else on his ribs, partially obscured by blood and contusion. Rachel worked with mechanical precision, her movements the counterpoint to the resident's fumbling. She knew where things needed to be before anyone asked. Knew how to position the fall line so it wouldn't snag during transport to imaging. And then she found them. Dog tags. Tangled in the fabric of what was left of his undershirt, wrapped around his neck like he'd been wearing them underneath everything else. Military protocol. You never let them leave your body. Rachel carefully unwound them from the fabric, her fingers moving with deliberate care despite the urgency surrounding her. Blood still warm on the metal. She read the name, and her hand stopped moving for half a heartbeat. Captain James Voss. The room continued its controlled chaos around her. Someone was calling out vitals. Someone else was inserting an arterial line. A resident was asking about chest x-rays. But Rachel's breath had caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat, and for a moment the fluorescent light seemed to hum at a different frequency, one that only she could hear. James Voss. The man who'd called her son Miguel on the radio every morning at 0600 hours from Ramadi. The commanding officer who'd brought Miguel home from the 75th Ranger Regiment deployment with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a pulse. The officer who'd written her a personal letter after Miguel's squad took fire in the Jolan district. The man who said in that letter that Miguel was the best junior enlisted he'd ever served with, that Miguel had saved 3 soldiers' lives, that Miguel had his word that everyone on his team would come home. Everyone on his team had come home. Rachel slipped the dog tags into her scrub pocket. The metal was warm against her ribs, still carrying the heat from his body. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, but her voice remained steady. "Vitals are stabilizing slightly with fluid resuscitation," she said to no one in particular. "He needs imaging. Now." Dr. Mercer glanced at her with the kind of look a man gives to something that's wandered into his space uninvited. His eyes were pale blue and utterly devoid of warmth. He didn't acknowledge her observation, which meant he'd rejected it. He turned instead to one of the residents. "We'll get a CT," he said. "Trauma protocol. Full workup." Rachel continued her assessment without waiting for further instruction. She positioned the patient's arms in the correct alignment for imaging. Checked his pupils, sluggish, but reactive. Ran her hands along his ribs, assessing for fractures with the kind of clinical touch that came from having done this on blood-soaked desert sand under the kind of heat that made air shimmer. 3 fractures on the right side. Possible flail chest. No pneumothorax yet, but his lungs were working hard. That's when she noticed it. The jacket, crumpled beneath the stretcher. Military issue, the kind that wasn't sold in civilian stores. She reached for it without thinking, the automatic motion of someone who'd been trained to preserve evidence. There was a patch on the inside of the lining, sewn into the seam with careful stitches. Faded now, the colors washed out by desert sun and laundry cycles. But unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time around the 75th Ranger Regiment. A unit patch. Hidden in the seam. Rachel's mind moved through the implications like someone navigating a minefield. You didn't hide your unit patch unless someone didn't want you identified. You didn't arrive at an ER with no wallet and no ID unless something had gone deliberately wrong. You didn't end up bleeding in an alley behind a warehouse district in Savannah unless you'd been running from something, or toward something, or someone had very deliberately put you there. She folded the jacket carefully and placed it on the chair in the corner of the bay. Her movements were precise, economical, the physical expression of a mind working through tactical problems. "The patient's chart," Dr. Mercer said. His voice was the kind of voice that expected instant compliance. "I'll need a complete history." "No history available," Rachel said. "No identification. No medical records on file." Mercer's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his pale eyes. "A calculation. An assessment." He looked at Rachel for maybe 2 seconds, really looked at her, and she could almost see him filing away the observation. Temp nurse. Adequate technical competence. But she'd moved too quickly to the jacket. She'd positioned the patient like she'd done it before. Her vitals assessment had been the kind of thing you only learned by doing it under pressure. She met his gaze and held it. Composure was armor. Composure was invisibility. "I'll start the admission paperwork," Rachel said. "John Doe Protocol. We'll establish identity once imaging is complete." Mercer turned away without responding. That was typical. The silent dismissal. The confirmation that she was background noise, just another body moving through his department. It was exactly what she needed. The dog tags felt warm against her ribs. Captain James Voss was being wheeled toward imaging, and Rachel Torres was already thinking 3 moves ahead, the way soldiers did, the way she'd been trained to do. The way no one at Seattle General would ever suspect, because she was just a temp nurse with a diploma mill certificate, and no one looked twice at people like that. But that wasn't the whole truth. The truth was in the way her hands had moved when she cut away his shirt. The truth was in the precise location where she'd positioned the fall line. The truth was in the fact that she'd recognized the unit patch before her conscious mind had finished processing what it meant. The truth was something she'd been waiting 3 months to find, and it had just arrived at Seattle General in an ambulance with vitals crashing and no identification. Mercer watched from the nursing station, his silver-haired profile framed by computer screens. He was making notes in the chart. Documenting her movements, probably. Filing away observations. He'd already decided what she was, a temporary body filling a gap in the schedule, replaceable and invisible. He had no idea that the woman in scrubs moving through his department was operating on a level of tactical awareness he couldn't begin to comprehend. That she was assessing not just his patient's medical condition but his movements, his reactions, his decision-making patterns. That she was here for a reason that had nothing to do with a 3-month placement at Seattle General. The fluorescent lights hummed their anxious frequency. The ER continued its organized chaos. And Rachel Torres walked toward the imaging department with the dog tags warm against her skin and James Voss's blood still drying on her hands, knowing that the next 48 hours would change everything. The ER continued its organized chaos as morning arrived with the weight of institutional hierarchy. Rachel had been back on the floor for 6 hours when the overhead speaker crackled at 10:24 a.m. Grand rounds, 15 minutes. Conference room B. She knew what that meant. The residents would gather. The attendings would present cases. And Dr. Mercer would find his audience. She finished her charting at the nursing station, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision she'd once used to field strip an M4. Every note documented precisely. Every medication timing exact. Every assessment thorough. The work was flawless, and she knew it. That was the problem. The conference room already hummed with 20 people when she arrived, 15 residents in their short white coats, 3 attending physicians, 2 physician assistants, and Dr. Mercer standing at the front with a remote control in his hand and the kind of smile that made the air pressure change. He saw her slip into the back and his expression sharpened. Predatory. She'd seen that look before, on men deciding whether to fight or talk. Mercer was choosing to talk. "Before we begin," he announced, his voice carrying the theatrical precision of a practiced performer, "I want to discuss a case study in protocol deviation. A learning opportunity for our newer residents." He pressed the remote. Rachel's charting appeared on the screen behind him, her intake notes for a male patient admitted Tuesday evening with abdominal trauma. Her vitals documentation. Her medication timings. Her assessment notes. All of it projected in 18-point font for the room to dissect. "This," Mercer said, circling her notes with a laser pointer that drew red light across her carefully documented observations, "is what happens when diploma mill temps play real nurse." He let that phrase sit. Several residents shifted. One looked directly at Rachel, then away. Notice here, the red dot landed on her medication timing. This nurse decided she knew better than protocol. Gave the 4 antibiotic 8 minutes before the physician order was actually written. Presumptuous timing. Dangerous. Rachel's jaw tightened by exactly 1 millimeter. She breathed in through her nose. Ice flooded her veins, but her hands remained at her sides, steady as surgical laser beams. Mercer turned a page. Her assessment notes filled the screen. And look at this narrative. Patient presenting with classic symptoms of compartment syndrome in right lower extremity. Clinical indicators suggest fasciotomy within the hour. Clinical indicators? This nurse is making surgical recommendations. His voice dripped with contempt. One of the attending physicians, a woman named Dr. Patel, actually winced. The red laser pointer circled the words like accusations. That patient went to surgery. The compartment syndrome was real. The fasciotomy was necessary. Mercer paused, letting the irony wash over the room. Which means this temporary nurse's presumptuous assessment was actually correct. But that's not the point, is it? Rachel watched him from the back of the room, her face a mask of cold stillness. Her eyes flat. Unblinking. She'd learned this stare in advanced interrogation resistance training at Fort Bragg, the look that gave nothing away, that suggested she was watching him from a distance even while standing 30 feet away. The point, Mercer continued, turning to address the residents directly, is that we have standards. Credentialing processes. Hierarchy exists for a reason. When people like clipboard here, he gestured vaguely toward Rachel, bypass that hierarchy, when they start thinking they're doctors instead of nurses, it erodes the entire system. He said, clipboard with a smile. The nickname was calculated. Designed to land. designed to make her objects of derision rather than her competence the topic. Several residents actually smiled at the cruelty. The fluorescent panels overhead buzzed their endless mechanical song. Rachel didn't blink. "I'm not saying she's incompetent," Mercer said, which meant he was absolutely saying exactly that. "I'm saying she's dangerous. Overconfident. The kind of nurse who thinks a 6-week accelerated program makes her qualified to override years of medical training. Seattle General has credentialing standards for a reason. And I'm going to ensure that this hospital maintains those standards, regardless of how many cases she might accidentally stumble through." He clicked the remote. The screen went black. Questions. A resident raised his hand. Was the patient outcome favorable? "That's not relevant," Mercer said immediately. Rachel met his eyes from the back of the room. That same cold stare. That same absolute stillness. When the grand rounds ended 5 minutes later, Mercer moving on to a different patient, a different lecture, satisfied with his performance, she turned and walked out. Her footsteps measured. Her breathing controlled. The dog tags in her scrub pocket felt like a stone. 2 hours later, at 2:14 p.m., Rachel was standing in front of the vending machine on the 3rd floor. The corridor was empty except for her and the hum of the machine's compressor. She was selecting black coffee, the same blend she'd drunk on every single operation for the past 9 years, when she heard Mercer's voice carry around the corner. His voice was deliberately loud. Meant for her to hear. "Dr. Patterson," he was saying to a young intern, "let me be clear about the situation. That nurse we were discussing in grand rounds? Torres?" The intern made a non-committal sound. "People like her are a liability. Community college credentials masquerading as real training. No actual foundation. Just barely scraping by." Rachel's hand paused on the coffee selection button. She was listening now. Fully. Completely. The way she'd learned to listen during intelligence briefings in Ramadi when the difference between hearing and understanding meant whether you came home with 12 fingers or 10. "I'm looking into her background right now," Mercer continued. Rachel could picture him, leaning against a wall, performing for the intern the way he'd performed for the residents. Establishing dominance. Creating allies. If her credentialing is as questionable as I suspect, I'm having security pull her files. Full background check. And if, when, we find discrepancies, she'll be escorted out by end of shift. He paused. "Clear." "That seems fair," the intern offered quietly. "It's more than fair," Mercer said. "It's necessary." Rachel pressed the button. The machine hummed. A plastic cup dropped. Coffee poured in a dark stream. She listened to Mercer's footsteps move closer to the vending machine alcove, heard him say something else, something about people like that and protocol violations, and then he was rounding the corner. He saw her standing there with her coffee cup suspended at chest height. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Rachel turned to face both men. The intern was young, maybe 25, with a kind of face that showed everything he was feeling. Mercer's expression held triumph. He'd wanted her to hear this. Wanted her to know that he was coming for her credentials, that her time here was ending, that he had institutional power and she had nothing but a temporary badge. Rachel raised the coffee cup to her lips. Took a sip. The coffee was hot and bitter and real. Then she lowered the cup, looked at Mercer with that same cold, flat stare she'd maintained through the entire grand round's humiliation, and said the only sentence that mattered. "When you're done performing for an audience that isn't impressed," she said, her voice surgical in its precision, each word exactly right, not a syllable wasted, "the patient in bay for still needs someone competent." She turned and walked away. Her footsteps measured against the linoleum. Her shoulders straight. Her hand steady even though ice flooded her veins like a winter river, not fear, but restraint, the kind of terrible calm that comes from 9 years of knowing exactly how dangerous you are and choosing not to show it. Behind her, she heard the intern say something inaudible. Heard Mercer's response cut short. She didn't look back. That was the whole point of the walk away. Don't look back. Don't react. Don't give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd landed. What Mercer didn't know was that Rachel had been placed at Seattle General on classified orders. The nursing cover was her operational mission. Command had sent her here to determine if Captain Voss had been compromised during his time in Ramadi, or if someone inside this hospital was systematically targeting Rangers returning from that theater. 3 soldiers with antibiotic-resistant infections in 4 months. The pattern was too precise to be coincidence. Rachel spent the next 6 hours monitoring Voss's ICU bay from adjacent rooms, moving with the fluid precision of someone trained in covert surveillance. She noted every physician who entered his suite, documented each medication change, tracked unusual delays in treatment protocols. At one point, a pharmacy tech arrived with an 4-fluid bag, a 500 milliliter solution of dextrose and saline with what appeared to be a custom batch number. Rachel watched through the small window. Watched the tech connect it to Voss's line. Watched him move on to the next patient. At 11:27 p.m., the hospital quiet in that deep way that only hospitals could achieve, Rachel sat at the empty nursing station with a stack of supply manifests. She photographed each one with her phone, a secure device with encryption that would make the Pentagon's IT team weep. Batch numbers. Delivery dates. Vendor codes. She cross-referenced them against the infection timelines. 3 Rangers. 3 separate infection events. But the 4 fluid batches came from the same supplier. And those batches had discrepancies. Missing documentation. Unusual gaps in the chain of custody. The next morning, Mercer announced new staff rotations during the 7 a.m. huddle. 14 nurses stood around the central station while he consulted his tablet. "I'm making some adjustments to optimize our coverage," he said. "Torres, you're covering pediatrics for the next week." Rachel heard the words as though they were coming from very far away. Pediatrics was 2 floors down. Different building access. She'd have no visibility into Voss's ICU status. She'd have no way to protect him. She nodded once. Understood. That evening, she tried to check on Voss anyway. Just a routine wellness check. Just 5 minutes. She walked to the ICU entrance and the charge nurse, one of Mercer's frequent lunch companions, looked up from her computer. "Rachel," Dr. Mercer put a note on Captain Voss's chart. "Restricted access. You're not on the approved visitor list." The word captain hung in the air between them. Nobody called patients by their rank unless they had military background or the captain in question had made it impossible to ignore. "Administrator's orders," the charge nurse added, not unkindly. Rachel stood in the doorway. Her mind calculated angles and options the way a chess player calculates 3 moves ahead. Voss was isolated. Mercer had been systematic about dismantling her position. The nurses who'd witnessed her save him on arrival were suddenly assigned to different shifts. The doctors who might have noticed her competence had been told she was a liability. And now she couldn't reach the patient who carried information someone wanted buried. The dog tags in her scrub pocket felt heavier. Warmer. She could still feel Voss's blood drying on her hands from that first night, could still remember the way his vital signs had crashed in Bay 4 and the way her body had moved before her brain could catch up. She turned and walked back toward the elevator with steady hands and ice in her veins and absolutely no way to explain what was happening without ending the mission. Behind her, unseen, Mercer watched from a distant corridor and smiled. The night air hit Rachel like a wall of humidity as she walked out of Seattle General at 11 p.m., her scrubs damp with sweat that wasn't hers. The parking lot was empty except for her 2007 Civic and a security light that flickered like a failing heartbeat. She didn't drive home. She drove south on Highway 17 with no destination in mind, just the need to be somewhere Mercer wasn't, somewhere the fluorescent lights didn't buzz overhead like angry wasps, somewhere she could think without an audience. The diner appeared at mile marker 14, a lonely rectangle of light in an ocean of Georgia darkness. Marie's truck stop, the faded sign promised hot coffee and pie. Rachel ordered coffee she didn't want from a waitress who didn't ask questions. The booth was vinyl, split at the seams, and it faced the window. The glass was so dark it functioned as a mirror. Rachel stared at her own reflection and didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her scrubs were wrinkled. Her hair had come loose from its bun somewhere around the moment Mercer had made his first phone call to the state nursing board. That call had happened at 2:56 p.m. She knew because she'd watched him walk past the break room, phone already pressed to his ear, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Captain Torres," he'd said. Not that temp nurse. Not Rachel. He'd used her military rank, which meant he was playing the credibility angle, which meant he'd already decided to dismantle her piece by piece. By 3:15 p.m., the administrator had called her into his office. A small room. Fluorescent lights. A diploma on the wall from some university in Connecticut. The administrator had been apologetic in that way that men are apologetic when they're about to hurt you but want you to understand it was procedural. "Dr. Mercer has raised some concerns about your credentials," he'd said. "Nothing we can't clear up, but given the sensitive nature of your assignment here, we need to verify your nursing licensure through the state board directly. Routine background check protocol." Rachel had nodded. Smiled. Said nothing. Because she understood what Mercer had done. He hadn't attacked her directly. He'd been smarter than that. He'd weaponized bureaucracy. He'd made a phone call to the right people and set in motion a chain reaction that would take weeks to unwind. By then, Voss would be unmonitored. By then, if Mercer really was the threat, if he really was the one diverting contaminated supplies, if he really was the one infecting Rangers, Voss would be exposed. The coffee in front of Rachel was now stone cold. She'd been sitting in this booth for 3 hours. The waitress had stopped offering refills around 1 a.m. The diner had emptied out except for a trucker in a corner booth who'd been asleep since midnight, his head tilted against the window, his breathing steady and unburdened. Rachel envied him with an intensity that surprised her. At 4:33 p.m. yesterday, Mercer had made his second move. He'd altered the staff rotation. Rachel had discovered it when she checked the digital schedule on her phone. She was supposed to be on the ICU for the next 4 days. Instead, the system now showed her reassigned to the pediatric wing, starting tomorrow. The pediatric wing was on the opposite side of the hospital. 3 corridors away from Voss. 3 corridors away from the secure wing where post-operative Rangers were monitored after classified procedures. But it wasn't just the reassignment. It was also the nurses. The ones who had been with her in Bay 4 when she'd called for the 14-gauge needle. The ones who'd seen her work. Marcus, the RN with 22 years of ER experience who'd nodded at her with something that looked like respect. Jennifer, the respiratory tech who'd adjusted the ventilator without being asked because she understood the plan. Both of them were being pulled from the ICU rotation too. Not together. Scattered across different departments at different times, like Mercer was deliberately breaking apart whatever unit might defend her. By 6:27 p.m., Mercer had made his third call. Rachel had intercepted the interdepartmental memo, not physically, but through the hospital's shared email system, where she still had access to general announcements. The memo was addressed to security and the nursing director. It raised concerns about a temporary staff member who might not be following proper credentialing protocol. It didn't name her. It didn't have to. Everyone would know. And then came 7 p.m., when Mercer had appeared in the secure wing with a medical bag. Rachel had been in the visitors' lounge on the 4th floor, the one with the windows that overlooked the main entrance. She'd been monitoring the floor reports through her phone, pulling up every scrap of information she could about Voss's condition. His vitals were stable. His pain management was adequate. His antibiotics were being administered on schedule. Everything was normal until the moment the medical bag appeared. She'd seen Mercer walk past the nursing station with that bag, had watched him pause at the door to the secure wing. The badge reader had beeped. The door had opened. He'd walked in, and Rachel had felt something cold and precise crystallize in her chest. Not fear. Something worse. Helplessness. She'd tried calling the floor. The nurse who answered, her name was Patricia, fresh out of school, eager to please, had said, Dr. Mercer left specific instructions not to be disturbed. He's doing a private examination. Private. The word had tasted like copper. Rachel had hung up and done what she'd been trained to do. She'd opened the hospital's medication management system on her phone and scrolled through Voss's recent treatments. There. A new for antibiotic order. Ordered by Mercer. Administered by Patricia. A brand that matched the discrepancies she'd found in the supply manifests. The ones with the diverted shipments. The ones that led nowhere. Her hands had gripped the phone until her knuckles turned white, and she'd realized something that made her chest tighten. She'd found the threat. She'd identified the vector. And she couldn't do anything about it without blowing her cover, which would end the mission, which would mean Command would pull her out and Mercer would disappear, and the Rangers would keep getting infected, and Miguel's friends would keep dying in hospital beds with nobody watching, nobody documenting, nobody giving a damn. So she'd driven to Highway 17. Now, at 3 a.m., staring at her reflection in the black window of a truck stop diner, Rachel pulled the dog tags from her scrub pocket. They were warm. Body heat had kept them warm for 12 hours. The metal caught the diner's light and threw it back at her, a small, pale reflection in the darkness. The name was worn but still visible. James Voss. 75th Ranger Regiment. Ramadi. Miguel would know this man. Miguel would have trusted him. Miguel would expect Rachel to protect him. And she was failing on all counts. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the feeling of having all the pieces of the puzzle and no legal way to move them. It was the understanding that Mercer had moved faster and smarter than she'd anticipated. He wasn't just insulting her anymore. He wasn't just making dismissive comments. He was systematically removing her ability to act. By tomorrow, she'd be in the pediatric wing, 247 meters from Voss. By day 3, the State Nursing Board would have opened a formal investigation into her credentials, which would trigger a background check that would stay confidential but would create a flag in the system. By day 5, if she hadn't proven something, Command would pull her. The mission would be considered compromised. And Mercer would have won. The waitress appeared with a carafe, eyebrows raised in a wordless question. Rachel shook her head once. The waitress left. The trucker in the corner booth shifted in his sleep, and his head rolled against the window with a soft thud that made Rachel flinch. She closed her fingers around the dog tags. The metal was cool now. It had finally matched her body temperature, and now it was starting to cool further. In another hour, it would be the same temperature as the air around it, just another object, just another piece of metal with a name on it. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let Voss become just another name. Just another ranger who came home infected with something no one could explain, something that would eat through his system while doctors stood around and called it sepsis, called it an infection, called it bad luck, called it anything except what it was, a calculated attack from someone inside the hospital who knew exactly what he was doing. Rachel's phone vibrated. A single text from an unknown number. The message was encrypted, the kind her handler used when communication needed to be invisible to standard surveillance. It read, "Status update required. Secure channel. 0400 hours. 1 hour." Rachel put the dog tags back in her pocket and pressed her forehead against the cold window glass. The diner hummed around her. The fluorescent lights above her head buzzed like insects trapped in plastic. Outside, the darkness was absolute. No traffic. No lights. No movement. Just the sense of a world that had moved on, a world where she wasn't sitting in a truck stop at 3 in the morning trying to figure out how to save a man's life without destroying her own. But that wasn't the worst part. The call came at 5 in the morning. Rachel's personal line, the one that wasn't supposed to ring anymore. Captain James Voss was crashing. Asymmetric chest. Trachea deviated. Tension pneumothorax, the kind that collapsed lungs and stopped hearts in minutes. She was 90 miles away in a rental apartment she'd stopped decorating 3 months ago because staying felt like a luxury she didn't deserve. She didn't ask questions. She pulled on the same clothes from yesterday, grabbed her temp badge, technically still active for 2 more hours on this shift, and drove 90 miles an hour north on I-95 with rain hammering the windshield like bullets on a tin roof. Seattle General's parking garage was still dark when she arrived. Her hand steady on the steering wheel even though ice flooded her veins. The badge reader at the service entrance hesitated for 1 second. Then the light turned green. Muscle memory took over as she moved through the corridors. Stairs instead of elevators. The path muscle remembered from 3 months of surveillance work disguised as temp nursing. The ICU was coming alive with shift change, nurses moving between patients, the usual organized chaos of 6 in the morning. Bay 7. She could hear it before she saw it. The alarm on the cardiac monitor singing a high-pitched scream. The ventilator's mechanical wheeze. Voss's chest rising unevenly, one side flat, the other straining. His skin the color of old concrete. The resident on call, a young man, maybe PGY2, eyes wide, was frozen with a phone in one hand, the other hovering over Voss like he was afraid to touch anything. Cardiology was on the way. 20 minutes out. Maybe longer if they hit traffic. 20 minutes was forever. Rachel walked past the charge nurse without speaking. The charge nurse opened her mouth to protest. Rachel was already reaching for the crash cart, her fingers finding the supply drawer before her brain finished registering the scene. A 14-gauge angiocath needle. Alcohol wipe. Her hands move the way hands move when they've done something 1,000 times, when muscle memory isn't memory anymore, it's just the body knowing what the mind refuses to admit it knows. Mercer arrived as she was identifying landmarks on Voss's chest. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. A point on his body that was about to become the difference between breathing and dying. She could feel Mercer in the doorway before she saw him. The way the air pressure changed when certain people entered rooms. The kind of presence that made fluorescent light seem dimmer. Get her out of here. His voice was bright with fury. She's not authorized for ICU. Security. Page security right now. His hands were trembling. Not from fear. From rage. The kind of rage that comes when someone has suddenly lost control of a situation they believed they owned completely. Rachel didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for orders or clearance or anyone's blessing. She swabbed the site with alcohol. Felt the ribs beneath her fingertips. Found the space between them. Muscle memory wasn't hesitation. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping, the sound of pressure releasing, the sound of a body suddenly remembering how to breathe. O2 sat climbing on the monitor. 70. 75. 82. The alarm silenced. The resident exhaled. Voss's chest began rising evenly again. You just assaulted a patient without physician oversight. Mercer was shouting now, his voice cracking. That's criminal. That's practicing medicine without a license. Security. I want her arrested. Call the police. 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. They looked apologetic. They looked confused. The resident was staring at Rachel with something like awe and something like fear, the look people get when they realize they've been standing next to someone operating on a level they hadn't seen coming. She saved his life, the resident said quietly. She violated every protocol we have. Mercer's hands were shaking. He gripped the counter. She is a temporary nurse worker with no ICU certification. She performed a surgical procedure. This is exactly what I've been saying, exactly why we need to remove people like her from our facility. His voice had climbed higher. Desperation mixed with rage. The sound of someone losing the narrative he'd worked so carefully to build. The security guard stepped forward. Rachel didn't resist. She moved toward the elevator with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Her badge was deactivated before she reached the ground floor. She knew it without checking. She could feel the moment the security system shut her out, a small digital click in her chest, the sound of a door closing. By noon, everything was gone. Her locker cleared. Her temporary credentials flagged. A formal complaint filed with the state medical board alleging criminal practice of medicine without licensure. Practicing medicine without authorization. Endangering a patient. Assault. The words were very specific. Very deliberate. Mercer had made 3 phone calls in rapid succession from the ICU while Rachel was giving a statement to hospital security. She'd watched him through the glass partition of the charge nurse's station. The hospital administrator's office. His personal attorney. The state licensing board. His voice carrying through the phone lines with the precision of someone who knew exactly which buttons to push, which relationships to leverage, which systems existed specifically to protect people like him. She sat in her car in the parking lot at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The rain had stopped. The sun was trying to break through. She removed her scrubs for what might be the last time and held them in her lap like they were evidence from a crime she'd committed. Her hands weren't shaking. That was the thing about training, about years of learning to function under pressure. The body just kept moving. The body didn't get to fall apart until the mission was over. The body waited. Voss was alive. That was the only thing that mattered. Voss was breathing. His oxygen saturation stable. His trachea no longer deviated. His heart still beating in that asymmetric chest. But he was vulnerable now. And Rachel was burned. The temp nurse who'd saved a patient would become the disgraced temp nurse who'd violated protocols, who'd overstepped her authority, who'd assaulted a patient under the care of a respectable physician with 2 decades of practice and connections that ran deep into hospital administration. Mercer had won. She could see it clearly now. He'd played this perfectly. He'd let her save the patient, had needed her to save the patient, because if Voss died, there would be questions. But now she was compromised. Now she was a liability. Now she was the problem that needed removing, and he had every institutional tool at his disposal to do it. The dog tags were still in her scrub pocket. She pulled them out. Captain James Voss. 75th Ranger Regiment. The metal was warm. The engraving sharp enough to cut. She'd worn these tags herself once. Sewn a faded unit patch inside a jacket lining once. Carried secrets that cost lives when revealed. But that was another life. That was Captain Rachel Torres, not the temp nurse sitting alone in a parking lot watching her future get carefully dismantled by a man who'd never served a day in his life. Her personal phone sat silent on the dashboard. No one was calling. No one from command. No one from the Pentagon, no one with extraction orders or abort signals. Just silence. Just rain dripping off the car's edge. Just the sound of her own breathing and the question that had been building since 5 in the morning, had she just destroyed the entire operation by refusing to let a good man die? Then her phone rang. Her phone rang at 6:33 a.m. on a Tuesday, just as she was pouring coffee that had gone cold 3 hours earlier. The number on the screen had no name, just a Washington, D.C. area code and a prefix she recognized from classified briefing protocols. The voice was female, clipped, administrative. Captain Torres, this is Pentagon personnel. We need you at Seattle General Hospital within 2 hours. Bring your service record. The line went dead. Rachel set down the coffee cup and dressed in her army uniform for the first time in 3 months, the fabric carrying the faint smell of cedar from storage. The dress uniform felt like armor. Like identity. Like the truth finally breaking through. The administrator's office at Seattle General smelled like fresh paint and expensive cologne, the kind Dr. Mercer wore, sandalwood and desperation. But he wasn't the one in charge anymore. Not here, not now. A Marine colonel in dress blue stood by the window, his posture a straight vertical line. A 2-star general sat in the administrator's chair. And Captain James Voss was already there, leaning on a cane, his left leg still favoring the trauma that had almost taken him 3 months ago. When Voss saw Rachel enter, something shifted in his face. He stood straighter. The cane became almost ceremonial. Tower 6, he whispered, using the call sign from Ramadi, the one that meant only one thing: I recognize you. Rachel closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself 1 second of relief. The mission was over. He knew. She was seen. When she opened her eyes again, her face was stone. The general gestured to a leather chair facing the desk. Rachel sat, boots squared with the tile below her. The Marine colonel, his nameplate read Clayton, and his eyes held the weight of someone who'd made impossible decisions in the dark, opened a folder marked classified. His voice was measured, deliberate, designed to carry the weight of official record. Captain Rachel Torres, awarded the Bronze Star for valor during combat operations supporting the 75th Ranger Regiment in Ramadi. He paused, letting the words settle into the room like shrapnel into sand. For extraordinary heroism in action against an enemy force while serving as a forward surgical asset. Another pause. 2 Purple Hearts. Combat medical certification with specialization in emergency trauma. He looked up from the document. Assigned to this hospital under code name Nightingale on orders directly from United States Special Operations Command. The words hung in the air like a held breath. Dr. Mercer, who had been standing near the window in his white coat, now looking like a costume, like a lie, made a sound that might have been a laugh or a choking sob. There's been some mistake, he said, his voice pitching higher. She's just a temporary nursing contractor. I reviewed her credentials myself. This is some kind of administrative error. His hand moved toward the desk phone. The general's expression didn't change, but something in the room's pressure shifted. Sit down, Dr. Mercer, the general said quietly. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the casual certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. Mercer Saturday. His hands began to shake. The general rose, and when he rose, the entire room seemed to rise with him. His uniform carried 5 rows of ribbons, and his presence made the air pressure change, the way a storm front materializes on a clear afternoon. He walked to Rachel's chair and rendered a salute so sharp it could cut glass, his hand moving with the precision of 30 years of discipline. Rachel returned it, her arm moving on muscle memory that never forgot itself, even under a temp nurse's cover. Captain, the general said simply. Then he turned toward the Pentagon liaison who had materialized sometime during the Marine colonel's reading, a woman in a charcoal suit with a secure phone clipped to her belt. Show them, the general said. The liaison opened her laptop on the administrator's desk. Her voice carried the flat effect of someone delivering evidence in a federal courtroom, which she probably did routinely. Captain Torres was assigned to monitor returning Rangers from classified operations. Specifically, to investigate a pattern of targeted infections appearing in soldiers recovering from the Ramadi campaign. She turned the screen toward Mercer. Between March and August, 14 Rangers developed septic infections originating from contaminated for supplies. All 14 cases involved supplies logged through the hospital's restricted supply chain. All 14 cases showed traces of Acinetobacter baumannii contaminated at the source, not from hospital exposure but from deliberate introduction. Mercer's face went white. The color drained like someone had opened a valve. Someone was replacing sterile 4 bags with contaminated ones, the liaison continued. Someone with administrator credentials. Someone with access to both the supply room and secure patient records. She paused. Let that land. We found the pattern when Captain Torres requested unusual access to patient histories. That's when the investigation started. The hospital IT specialist, a Navy veteran named Chen wearing the bearing of someone who'd served in actual combat, stepped forward with a second laptop. We recovered security footage, he said quietly. His voice had the rasp of someone who'd seen things that didn't have happy endings. 2:08 a.m. 4 days ago, Dr. Mercer entered the supply room using his administrative access. He swapped out 3 boxes of sealed for supplies with unmarked boxes from a pharmaceutical distributor in Phoenix. That distributor has no legitimate business license. We preserved every frame. Federal investigators have the complete data package. Chen turned the laptop around. The footage was grainy but unmistakable, Mercer's silhouette, his movements precise and deliberate, his hands working with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Multiple times. Rachel watched his face as he watched himself caught on camera, and she saw the moment his mind calculated that there was no escape, no explanation, no way out except forward through the nightmare. "Why?" Rachel said quietly. The room was so silent you could hear the ventilator in the hallway outside, the hiss and wheeze of mechanical breathing. Just the sound of survival. Just the sound of systems keeping people alive. Mercer's head snapped toward her. When he spoke, his voice had cracked open like old concrete. "You people," he spat. His hands gripped the chair. "You walk in here with your trauma and your hero worship and everyone bows down. Everyone genuflects. The decorated soldier. The specialist arriving from the war. But you don't have real credentials. You don't have real education. Just violence. Just the kind of accomplishment you get from pulling a trigger or holding someone while they bleed out, and everyone calls it heroism." His voice rose, uncontrolled now, the mask of professional courtesy finally slipping away completely. "I studied for 11 years. 11 years of medical school and residency and fellowship. I earned my position through intellect and discipline. And then they bring in temps like you, with your call signs and your classified orders, and everyone acts like you're some kind of saint." The room didn't move. Voss's grip on his cane tightened until his knuckles went pale. The general's voice came through like the sound of a heavy door closing. "So you infected soldiers," he said slowly, speaking each word as if Mercer needed time to hear what he'd actually confessed. "You deliberately contaminated supplies intended for men returning from combat. Men you knew. Men you treated. Why?" Mercer opened his mouth and closed it. His shoulders collapsed inward. Hospital security escorted him out of the office in handcuffs within minutes, his white coat stripped away, his credentials already being processed for revocation by the state medical board. Federal investigators arrived before Mercer's car cleared the parking lot. The general turned to Rachel and extended his hand. She stood and clasped it, not a handshake, but a formal grip of acknowledgement between two people who'd crossed the same difficult ground. "Your operation is complete, Captain. Well executed. Your son is safe. Your patient is safe. You're coming home now." Rachel felt something inside her chest that had been locked down for 3 months finally crack open. But her voice remained steady. "And the others?" she asked. The liaison smiled. It was the first genuine expression Rachel had seen from her. 14 soldiers. 14 lives that would have been lost if you hadn't been exactly where you needed to be. Even when it cost you everything. Voss stepped forward and put his free hand on Rachel's shoulder. The gesture said what words couldn't. "I know what you sacrificed. I know who you are. I know what it cost." 6 months later, Rachel stood at Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah, the Georgia heat rising off the tarmac in waves that made the horizon shimmer like water. Her Army dress uniform was pressed sharp enough to draw blood. The 75th Ranger Regiment transport was coming in from the south, the engines audible first as a vibration in the ground, then as a roar that filled the sky. Miguel's unit. Her son. Home. The wheels touched down with a puff of smoke. Soldiers poured out, duffel bags, weapons, the kind of careful exhaustion that comes from 14 months in a theater of operations where every decision carries consequences. Miguel saw her and ran. Rachel caught him and held on while his entire unit cheered, because every soldier there knew exactly what had happened at that hospital, and every single one of them knew Captain Rachel Torres had bled for it. Voss stood beside her, the cane long gone, his leg healed to the point where the limp was barely visible anymore. He was in dress uniform too, his bronze star catching the sunlight. "Your mom didn't just save my life in that trauma bay," Voss told Miguel. "She was running a covert operation. She gave up everything, her cover, her career, her position, to make sure I stayed alive long enough to get home to this." He gestured to the airfield, the soldiers, the families running toward the tarmac. "She did it for all of us. Miguel looked at his mother like he was seeing her for the first time. Because he was. The formal ceremony happened later that same day, in the shade of the barracks, with the general reading Rachel's citation aloud while the entire unit stood at attention. The words carried weight in history and the particular kind of honor that comes from sacrifice nobody gets to advertise. Some warriors fight on battlefields, the general said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Some warriors fight in hospitals. Some fight in both. Captain Rachel Torres fought in both. And she never broke. When the general pinned the medal to her uniform, Rachel didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She stood with the same perfect posture she'd maintained throughout, because composure was its own form of strength, and strength was what kept people alive. Later that week, driving through rural Georgia toward nowhere in particular, Rachel passed a medical supply van parked outside a tiny clinic in a town that didn't have a single traffic light. Through the window, she could see Dr. Mercer loading boxes from a warehouse. His medical license was gone. His career was gone. His reputation was gone. He was 43 years old and driving supplies for minimum wage in a place where nobody knew his name. He looked up from his work and met Rachel's eyes for just a moment as she drove past. She didn't slow down. She didn't acknowledge him. She just kept driving, because some stories don't need an ending, they just need an absence. At Miguel's homecoming barbecue that weekend, surrounded by rangers and their families and the kind of quiet celebration that comes from people who've earned the right to rest, someone asked Rachel how she'd managed to stay so calm during everything at the hospital. The whole mission. The humiliation. The retaliation. The moment when everything could have fallen apart. Rachel looked at Voss, then at Miguel, then at the dog tag she'd kept in her pocket the entire time, now polished until they caught the light like silver. The tags that had identified a soldier and saved a life and completed an operation nobody would ever officially acknowledge. You do what needs doing, she said quietly. And you don't quit until it's done. Voss raised his beer. His voice was clear and steady, the voice of a soldier who'd been brought back from the edge. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. The assembled rangers raised their bottles and cans in a gesture that transcended words. They drank to survival. They drank to missions completed. They drank to the ones who came home. If you've made it this far, you already know the answer to the question running through your head, yes, heroes walk among us. Sometimes they're in combat zones. Sometimes they're in hospital corridors. Sometimes they're fighting battles that nobody gets to see. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep hearing their stories. Like this video if you believe hidden strength deserves recognition. And comment below, what would you have done in Rachel's position? Would you have blown your cover to save one life? Let me know.